WashingTECH.
Hey, it's Joe, and I don't have to tell you, relationships are critical in Washington. But how do you, A, find out who the key players are, and B, figure out how to reach out to them? Well, I want to tell you about Leadership Connect. It's been an absolute lifesaver for us as we expand our operations and outreach here at WashingTECH. Leadership Connect, it's the digital service used by top federal contractors and government affairs leaders to contact decision makers and develop those strategic relationships. Visit leadershipconnect.io and join the community. I love it, and I'm 100% sure you will too. That's leadershipconnect.io. Try it now.
The threat of malicious interference in our elections hasn't gone away.
Welcome to the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast.
The latest tech law and policy news and brightest tech law and policy experts wherever you are.
So you can stay informed, on the move, in less time.
From Washington, D.C., it's the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast.
With Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Lawmakers set up efforts to rein in facial recognition companies' work with law enforcement. Federal authorities use marketing data to track suspects, and Gowri Ramachandran is my guest. Hey everybody, IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon announced plans to scale back the sale of their facial recognition technologies to law enforcement. But while those companies are some of the largest providers of such technologies, smaller competitors continue to supply police departments, and Amazon has only stated that it would stop selling facial recognition technology for 12 months as it awaits Congress to write new legislation. Many important studies have repeatedly demonstrated how these technologies produce biased outcomes when it comes to women and people of color. 10 also reported last week that technology companies also make substantial donations to police organizations. In 2018, the Supreme Court decided Carpenter v. U.S., in which it held law enforcement needs a search warrant before obtaining cell tower location data from carriers when they pursue suspects. But in an exclusive report, the Wall Street Journal explains how the police now circumvent Carpenter using marketing data, which is anonymized, but when correlated with other factors can reveal the personal identity of a suspect. These law enforcement agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, have concluded those data don't fall within the scope of data for which the U.S. Supreme Court requires probable cause per Carpenter, since the data doesn't come from cell phone data and instead comes from geolocation data. Ventel, the subject of the Wall Street Journal report and company that provided marketing data to the IRS, claims its data is pseudo-anonymized. It'll be interesting to see how courts and lawmakers consider how such pseudo-anonymized data should be treated in light of the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Facebook is still under fire for failing to adequately moderate misinformation posted by the president. Several civil rights organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, NAACP, Sleeping Giants, Color of Change, and others, called on advertisers to boycott Facebook after Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg repeatedly refused to even flag misinformation Trump posted a couple weeks ago, saying mail-in ballots pose a risk for voter fraud, a claim that is unsubstantiated. Several research reports, which we will get into shortly with Gowri Ramachandran, by prominent institutions, including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, have concluded mail-in ballots produce no meaningful advantage for either political party. Amidst the backlash, Facebook announced plans last week to invest $200 million to support Black-owned businesses and organizations. The company also announced an effort to register 4 million voters. Netflix founder and CEO Reed Hastings announced that Netflix would be investing $120 million in historically Black colleges and universities. President Trump continued to defy social media boundaries with more misleading and hateful content last week. On Thursday, the Trump campaign posted an ad containing the upside-down red triangle Nazis used to identify communists, socialists, and liberals in concentration camps. Facebook and Twitter removed that ad. On Friday, the president tweeted a manipulated video appearing to show a white child running after a black child with a fake lower third saying, quote, "terrified toddler runs from racist baby," end quote. Twitter initially flagged the tweet, but ultimately took it down. Both Twitter and Facebook also announced last week they've seen foreign actors evolve their social media propaganda efforts, but as yet, no coordinated efforts by state actors to manipulate election outcomes. After an 18-month appeal effort, Google has lost against French regulators who found the company violated Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, by failing to make it easy for users to determine how the company used their data, notice which required users to go through several steps, according to the French Council of State, France's highest administrative court, which upheld the $56 million fine it levied against Google back in January of last year. Finally, two prominent government relations pros, both of whom are African-American women, put Pinterest on blast last week for allegedly having a toxic work environment that is hostile to black employees. Ifeoma Zoma reported on Twitter that a white male inside Pinterest doxed her, sharing her private information publicly, and that the company failed to give her a pay raise. She also said that during her performance review, her manager criticized her for being outspoken during discussions around the company's new policy to stop advertising slave plantations for weddings. According to Azoma, the manager accused her of not both-siding the issue. Azoma also noted that her replacement, Erica Banks, also a black woman, also resigned. You can find links to all of these stories in the show notes. Stay with us. My guest today is Gowri Ramachandran, Counsel in the Election Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. She's currently on leave from her position as Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School in LA. At Southwestern, she taught courses in constitutional law, employment discrimination, critical race theory, and the Ninth Circuit Appellate Litigation Clinic, which received the Ninth Circuit's 2018 Distinguished Pro Bono Service Award. Gowri Ramachandran.
Thanks, Joe.
So states and local governments have stepped up efforts to ensure their electoral infrastructures are prepared in the event of a cyber attack or other externalities they don't have control over on election days. Many more than the presidential election. We have several state and local elections coming up as well. But let's assume every state and local government is where it needs to be. Those interventions are only designed to address elections taking place under normal circumstances. But now we have the COVID-19 pandemic to contend with. And with the presidential election less than 5 months away, what are some other problems that election officials and governments should be anticipating and preparing for?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that the threat of malicious interference in our elections hasn't gone away. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, Google announced that the Gmail accounts of people working on both Biden and Trump's campaigns had been targeted by people working for the Chinese and the Iranian governments. So election officials definitely should continue preparing some of the same things they were preparing for before the pandemic. For instance, attempted attacks on their voter registration database. So we've previously recommended at the Brennan Center that election officials create backups of the voter registration database on different servers in order to facilitate a recovery if there is a successful attack. And, we're still recommending that. It's still really important. But there are some security risks that might be new for election officials given the pandemic. So one example is that a lot of personnel are working from home right now, and that can increase the risk of a cyber attack. So election officials need to pay special attention now to making sure that they and their employees are complying with cybersecurity best practices. So, for instance, updating their devices regularly, using strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, training for employees on how to avoid phishing attacks. And then also voters are staying home, of course. So the popularity of voting by mail has surged. In Georgia's recent primary, for instance, more than 26 times as many voters requested a mail ballot as they did in the 2016 primary. So that means election officials might need to work with new vendors to help them fulfill mail ballot requests, and they're going to have to pay really special attention to the vendor's security practices. So we recommend using a vendor that accepts encrypted file transfers of the voters' data, their addresses, things like that. And also using vendors that limit access to that data while it's residing at the vendor. Also, vendors should be limiting access to blank ballots and keeping chain of custody logs. So that's another area that for some election officials might be new if they didn't have to work with vendors for mail balloting in the past. One of our most important recommendations at the moment is to just get ready to print and mail a lot of mail ballot packets for November. So most states do allow voters to request a mail ballot for any reason or due to fear of contracting or spreading coronavirus. And those packets, those mail ballot packets, a lot of times they require special envelopes. So election officials can't wait until the last minute to place their print orders or to do all their own printing in-house. And if everyone is asking vendors for the same services at the last minute all at once, they might not be able to accommodate that. So, for example, in Wisconsin, when the pandemic took voters and election officials by surprise earlier this year, clerks had a lot of trouble obtaining absentee ballot envelopes because the printers were closed down, the envelope suppliers were closed down. And fortunately, in that case, the state election commission was able to step in and obtain envelopes for all the clerks. But obviously, that kind of last minute scrambling is not ideal. And if election officials ran out of supplies, voters could suffer, not receive their mail ballots in time to meet deadlines. So one of the most important recommendations right now is to make plans for printing plenty of and much more than normal absentee ballot packets. Just as many election personnel are working from home, many voters are staying home as well. And as a result, they're really relying more on all of these online tools. So online methods for registering to vote, online mail ballot request tools. And as a result, election officials need to ensure that those websites are ready for surges in traffic from voters, as well as ready for potential malicious attacks. So we recommend load testing and services that distribute web traffic across servers. And as a fail-safe, if the websites do fail, officials should redirect voters to a site where they can at least submit their information before the deadline so that they can preserve that timely request for whether it's registration or getting a mail ballot.
So we're here with Gowri Ramachandran discussing the cybersecurity challenges municipalities are facing when it comes to elections during a pandemic and what kind of roadmap they should follow to keep them secure. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. So turning to mail-in voting, not something one would think is a highly technical way to address election security because it goes in the opposite direction of voting online and things like that. But we've argued, and others have argued as well, that it's probably one of the most secure ways to conduct elections. As you mentioned before, providing citizens still have the ability to vote in person. The president took to Twitter to blast Governor Newsom's executive order to allow mail-in ballots in addition to preserving in-person voting, making a number of, from our perspective, here, our words, not the Brennan Center's unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud. And Twitter included a disclaimer over that tweet, and the president retaliated with an executive order instructing the FTC and FCC to take action with authority they don't have to apply Section 230 to the Communications Decency Act to address what the president sees as an anti-conservative bias at tech companies. But at least one study I've seen, MIT I think it was, found that in-person voting doesn't favor one party over another. But several states are moving forward with it. So what happens after the election, Gowri? How do we sort of audit the results after the elections have happened?
Mail voting is, in fact, a very secure method of voting because it's on paper. So this means that there's a paper trail available to be manually inspected and audited after the election. And that's the best way to ensure that the tabulation machines haven't been hacked or misprogrammed. in a way that would change the outcome of an election. There's also many methods that jurisdictions use to ensure that mail balloting remains secure. For instance, ballot envelopes can include barcodes that can be used to track the ballot in case it gets lost. Jurisdictions can provide secure drop boxes for voters to return their ballots, so they don't have to worry about them being received in time or getting lost. So there's a lot of different methods that jurisdictions use. But to me, one of the most important things is that mail voting is a form of paper voting, so it is auditable.
And let's not forget in-person voting. What of the case studies suggested would be most effective when it comes to in-person voting? What are some of the fail-safes?
Well, we just saw in Georgia that there need to be plenty of resources available for in-person voting because some voters really do need to use this method, whether it's because they need assistance or they never received their mail ballot. In fact, in a way, in-person voting is the resiliency method for mail voting, since these surges in mail ballot requests can lead to processing errors where some voters don't get their ballots or don't get them in time. So in-person voting really is the fail-safe, and it needs to be properly supplied. So for instance, if a jurisdiction is using some kind of touchscreen voting machine for in-person voting, it's really important that emergency paper ballots be kept on hand in case those machines fail or they get misdelivered or poll workers can't figure out how to use them. Having those emergency paper ballots on hand ensures that voters can keep voting instead of having to wait around for some technician to arrive and fix the machine. They won't have to stand in line all day. Another really important sort of backup method that we think is important for in-person voting is having a backup paper poll book. So a lot of polling places nowadays use electronic poll books where voters can be checked in a little, it's almost like a little iPad device. And those are great and convenient, but if they have connection problems or they fail to work on election day, then voters can't be processed. So having a paper printout of the poll book on hand so that the poll workers can resort to that instead of, just trying to fix the electronic poll book and making voters wait. That's another way to make sure voters don't have to stand in line and they can continue to exercise their rights, even if there are some of these technical failures or malicious attacks to the in-person voting equipment. And then finally, one really important fail-safe is to have plenty of provisional ballot materials on hand. So a provisional vote is a type of vote where you can't figure out whether the voter is eligible or not, maybe because the electronic poll book isn't working, or maybe there's been some malicious attack on the voter registration database. And in that case, a provisional envelope can be used to let the voter vote and then hold the ballot for later and count it once you're able to fix the problem and determine whether the voter was eligible or not. So having plenty of those on hand in case there's some sort of attack on the registration database is an important fail-safe to make sure people don't get disenfranchised.
It's hard to believe we're less than 5 months before the presidential election, not to mention all of these elections in between. Lots for election officials to chew on and start implementing before it's too late. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us, Gowri, before we close? And where can we find you online?
Well, one of the main ideas I'd love to end on is the fact that it's really a lot of work to plan for a secure election in the midst of a pandemic, and a lot of resources are required. I talked about all of this, website testing, fail-safes, printing all these fail-safe paper ballots. A lot of resources are needed for election officials, and I hope, and we hope that Congress is able to provide funding in order to help them carry out all these plans. They know what needs to be done. They need the resources to do it. You can find me online at the Brennan Center website, which is brennancenter.org. And you can also follow the Brennan Center on Twitter, on Facebook, and access our resources there.
Gowri Ramachandran, Counsel in the Election Security Program at the Brennan Center at NYU Law School. Gowri, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes episode 235 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do here, please leave a detailed rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
WashingTECH.